This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hi everybody, my name's John Bleasdale, I'm the host of Writers on Film, and I just wanted to drop in before today's episode to talk to you briefly about the novel that I wrote, Connery, and which is available to order now from plumeria.co.uk. It's a great novel, I think. I mean, I wrote it, so, I'm going to be biased, but it's a film-adjacent novel. It's called Connery. It's about a young boy who grows up with a fantasy friend, Sean Connery, and he grows into adulthood, and the fantasy begins to curdle into something more dark and sinister. It is available from Plumeria and from wherever you get good books, except for Amazon. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and film critic, and today I'm delighted to be joined by Kristen Lopez, who is the author of a new book, Popcorn Disabilities, The Highs and Lows of Disabled Representation in the Movies. Thank you so much for joining me, Kristen.
Thank you for wanting to chat with me. I appreciate it.
Oh, well, after I read your book, this has to be one of the most entertaining and educational books I've read for a long time.
Thank you. That was exactly what I was going for. So I'm glad that it worked, that I actually pulled it off.
Truly, because I do feel myself, it's one of those things that I do think disabled rights and visibility is something that we could all do with a lot more education on. And I find
Yeah.
myself even to the very point of not knowing if disabled is exactly the right word to use, for instance. And
It
that's
is.
ridiculous.
It is. Yeah. And I mean, I've had, I put in the book that how I use language because there is, I don't want to say it's a bad faith argument about certain things, person first versus condition first. For me, disabled is just, I turn into Justin Timberlake in the Social Network. It's cleaner. Why
Mm.
use one word when, why would I want to use three people with disabilities when I could just use one? And most people would say that, disabled is the common parlance. Person with disability is totally fine. The words that I tell people you should never be using in 2026, special needs, take it out of the vocabulary. We don't want it. And handicap is slowly going out of vogue. So yeah, it's definitely one of those. Handy capable, also just not a word. Stop using it. I hate it. I don't like when we kind of mash two words together to make it sound like peppy. So yeah, those are the ones that I think, if I hear them, somebody says them, I'll usually assume they're maybe like an elderly person. If they're not an elderly person, I'm just kind of like, y'all need to figure it out. So yeah, but no, disabled is 100%. Like if you're using it, you are on the cool side.
Okay. I mean, handy capable sounds a little bit like somebody who would describe their grandmother as 80 years young.
Right? It's such a dumb word. It's such a dumb word. I'm just like disabled. It does have abled in the word too. Okay. So like you don't have to, create this new silly word to be like that person can still function and do things. I'm like, it just sounds like a word like some politician invented. I don't know if it is, but it just sounds like it.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think language is all about the groups themselves
Yeah.
identifying themselves and you listening to them. So, and it, it evolves over time, So
Yeah.
we have
Yeah.
that in all sectors of personal identity.
Yeah.
Let's go straight into your story in terms of your interest in movies, because reading your book, you have certain
certain films that very much sort of piqued your interest when you were first watching films. But I want to also get an understanding of where you come from as a journalist, as a writer, as someone who gets an interest in movies early on.
Yeah, I mean, movies have always been a part of my life. My parents were big movie people. They would take us to the theater. The drive-in was a big thing. I still love the drive-in. So I tell people, my parents would put us in the back of the car and we were supposed to sleep, but we never did. So I would often just spend a lot of time listening to movies. And I wouldn't know what they were, but they often sounded like way worse than I'm like, oh, my parents must be watching something really bad because it sounds horrible from the back of this car. So movies have always been something I've loved. And I never would have assumed I ha would get a job in, some sort of industry associated with it because, as a wheelchair user growing up in Sacramento, not exactly, the movie industry isn't knocking on your door. It's not in your backyard. We only get Lady Bird once every, generation, I think. So, when I was in school, I loved to write. I was a big reader. Um, and I would, when I took journalism class, in high school, I was the movie reviewer. So I was the film critic for my high school newspaper. And I started to realize that I might have been bad at my job because none of my peers were reading my reviews or at least going to see the movies that I was suggesting, but the teachers loved them because I was like, oh, go see Match Point. This was before, I became very anti Woody Allen, but I was like, Match Point is great. I was seeing movies that adults were gonna see, not the, stupid movies that my peers were watching. Although I'm a child of Napoleon Dynamite. So, um, it's always been something I've been interested in. And when I got my first journalism job, in quotes, at my high school prom. Somebody had seen an ad on Craigslist when that was still a thing, and they were like, "This website's looking for a movie reviewer," and I was like, "Cool!" I got a whopping $15 per review. I got one raise in the entire time that I worked there of $1. And I reviewed everything for them, films, books, the occasional music album that came out. And I still was kind of always saying like, I'll do this till I can get a real job. I'll do this until I can get something that will pay the bills. And then eventually, the years passed and I was like, oh, I guess this is my real job. I'm in my 20s now and I'm making some money and so it's definitely something where I figured like to be an entertainment journalist and to be a film critic, I figured you needed a degree, for that. Like somebody gave you a degree that said film critic. And I didn't realize until I started kind of researching that a lot of, film critics don't have film degrees. Sometimes they have journalism degrees. I have an English degree and some do. So it was really interesting to kind of come to the realization when I was like 25 and be like, oh, I guess I am a film critic now. I guess I am a film journalist. Saying journalist took a very long time for me to say. I would tell
Mm.
people like writer, and they would think I was a screenwriter. I'm like, no, I write, so eventually I've slowly come around to it, at my age to being like, oh, okay, I guess this is my real job now. I guess this is what I'm doing.
You can say author now as well.
I can. Yeah, that was easier for me to
Right.
say at that point because I had something tangible to show for it. So like when my first book came out from TCM, I was like, "Oh, okay. Now I have like actually something to like throw at people when I'm like, I'm an author," which was a lot of fun.
It's interesting those words. It's really, really interesting. Indeed, I, I, I had similar difficulty. I think with I always thought in my heart of hearts I was a writer, but it
Yeah.
was difficult to kind of transition from being somebody who writes to being a writer, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
Sort of like a teacher who writes, or somebody who has a day job and writes, to being no, no, no. This is what I do. This is kind of my most important thing.
Yeah, I mean, I tell people words have meaning, and that's something we've lost over the years. And so I think for me, the word journalist has always been politicized. So a journalist is somebody that's like in the trenches or, writing about world events or, doing something grandiose. I subscribe very much to like the journalism is Hemingway and Hunter Thompson type of mentality. And it's been really cool to talk about entertainment journalism, which I think people kind of erroneously think is fluffy writing. Oh, you're writing about celebrities and you're doing. I think that most people assume that it's like a notch above National Enquirer, and I'm like, no, like an actually good entertainment journalist is using all of the things that any other journalist is using, investigative reporting skills, contact building, analytical thought. And film criticism too is especially a very specific hard field for a writer, because you're not just saying whether something's good or bad. That's a Yelp review, You're actually telling a story and kind of pulling apart a film and weaving in this whole thing that culminates overall with like, is it good or bad?
Yeah, absolutely. It's not it I mean good and bad as well is different from whether you enjoy it or not.
Yeah.
There's I watched Blue Moon recently, the Ethan Hawke film, which I enjoyed very much, and then came out and had a conversation with my daughter who'd come to see it with me. And I got halfway through talking to her about it. She's a lot smarter than me, and I realized actually, it's not very good at all, is it? I mean, I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
I was in the moment, but yeah, that didn't make much sense, and I didn't
When
like
you
that.
start like disarticulating, everything, you're kind of like, oh, okay. When I have to explain what makes it good or bad, then you start to really realize like, oh, okay, do these flaws factor into whether a movie is perfect or not, So it takes a very diversified, writing, and it is very much writing. I tell young people, because I get a lot of young people that say they want to be critics, and I'm like, it's not just watching movies and telling me whether they're good or bad. I'm like, you need to have some sort of writing component to your background, because you're going to be spending a lot of time kind of articulating what makes something good or bad. And if you don't have a robust vocabulary, if you don't know, how to tell a story, it's going to be a lot harder for you, and people are going to feel the writing is very just like blah.
Yeah, I think what you said earlier as well about how you used to read a lot, I think is key to
Yeah.
that. I mean, Werner Herzog always puts that in his advice to filmmakers: read as much as possible. Don't worry so much about watching films as much
Yeah.
as reading books, because that's where the secret sauce is. Um,
It really is.
Yeah, and also you are a podcaster, and you have had, as you have said, you published a book with Turner Classic Music. No, okay, third time lucky. Turner Classic Movies. Did I say it right?
Yes.
How did you get involved with that?
Yeah, I mean, I've always been a big TCM fan. They were the first kind of company that when I started a blog back when blogging was fun. And they were the first, entertainment channel to like give me access to people, to invite me to their film festivals. They were very much a champion of like, if you like old movies, then we want to have you. They were on the cutting edge of really starting kind of to court people that had influence in that vein. And then once I, started to get my day job at IndieWire, where I was the TV editor, I had a colleague that had published a book through them, and I was like, how do you do that? Like, does that, I'm assuming that, there's this big secret process. And he's like, no, you just talk to the guy that writes for them. And he introduced me to John Malahai, who was the awesome publisher at the time that was working for their publishing arm. And he said, we have a book that's already greenlit. It's about literary adaptations. We just need an author for it. And you have a master's in English, so do you read a lot? And that was the first time in my life my English degree, college had ever factored into getting a job. So kids, if you think that, your degree is going to get you a work, not all the time. So I said
But
yes,
maybe
and he was like,
once.
okay, well, oh, Dan, were you going to say something?
No, but maybe once.
Exactly, maybe once. But he said, well, you still have to sell what you think the book is and yourself. So I had to write a pitch doc. I still had to pitch it like it was an idea that I had come up with, and they said yes, so we went back and forth on picking what books and what movies we were going to do. Um, I settled on 52, which I wish I could take credit. People were like, "Oh, one for every day of the year." And I was like, "Nope." Just seemed like a nice number at the time. It helped that there was a pandemic at the time that it got sold because I had free time to go to my day job, which was virtual at the time, and read and then watch movies and write this book. So yeah, the book it was a real training ground to see if I could do it, but it also made me realize when writing this book how easy I had the first book because the first book
Mm.
already had it had an ingrained structure. I didn't really come up with everything. TCM and I worked together. So with the second book, it was harder because it was all me. I had to sell the idea and I had to also figure out what the hell I was going to be talking about for X amount of pages. So the first book kind of spoiled me because the second book I was like, "Oh, this is the first book was the training wheels and the second book was like now we want you to maybe like run a marathon."
Now you're Thelma and Louise off the cliff in the car.
Exactly, yes. Figure out how to make it to the other end.
I'm just thinking we're showing our ages here with blogging and Napoleon Dynamite
Yeah, it's a
and
great time capsule.
tell us about the podcasting though, because that's interesting.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I got into podcasting. I'd gotten into podcasting when it was then new, when it was a new thing. Back in the day when you had to practically be a person who did code. So you had to make your own RSS feeds and everything. I tell people all the time, millennials, like we learned all the tech stuff, we just never applied it to like a job. So like most of us know basic HTML, most of us know basic like coding. So I had gotten into it, for a while, and I had done a couple podcasts over the years that had kind of come and gone, thankfully, because they were really embarrassing. But eventually I was doing my site, which at the time was called Journeys in Classic Film, and I wrote a lot about old films because I spent so much time during my regular job writing about contemporary movies that I really wanted to talk about kind of pre 1980s type of movies,
Mm.
and really further my education, and that seemed to grip a lot of people. So I started a podcast called Ticklish Business. This year will be my 10th year of doing it, which is very, very weird to hear. And it's been great. I mean, we've gotten to have, some great people on the podcast, a lot of TCM people, but also like Paul Feig, the director, and Anna Biller. And it's been awesome to kind of talk about old Hollywood and, what makes a movie great. We just did an episode of Dr. Dolittle. We talked about why that might be the worst Best Picture nominee of all time. So we get to kind of like grouse on some movies and celebrate the old Hollywood mentality that I think a lot of people know. They know Elizabeth Taylor, they know Marilyn Monroe, but we really want to try to talk about all of the other things and all of the other people and movies that existed, that made old Hollywood what it was.
It's so strange the sort of conveyor belt of the time that you live in, though, because I mean, I think I'm a little bit old. Actually, I think I'm quite a bit older than you. Born in '72. When I was a kid, people like Cary Grant and Robert Mitchum were still on talk shows,
Yeah.
and they so the yeah, I mean, Charlie Chaplin was still alive,
Yeah.
Um, you you have this sense that the history of film was still somehow present and with us, and nowadays it doesn't. It feels like almost feels like the pharaohs. It feels like it's gone away. It's in some.
Well, it's interesting. I just saw something on social about how if you look at this weird kind of backsliding we're doing culturally with re-upping things that millennials and Gen Xers were into, that there's this belief that culture is kind of stopped
Mm,
and that nothing within the most, the last 10 years has really any cultural footprint. At least that's how people marketing stuff and creating stuff are seeing it. Their belief is that culture is kind of stopped and that people just want the culture that made sense, several decades ago at this point. And I thought that was really interesting because it does make you wonder kind of what the cultural footprint of the 2020s is going to be. Is it just going to be regurgitation of the 80s and 90s at this point? And I think that's really sad. I think that's really sad because if that were the case and say culture kind of stopped in the 80s, how would we look at films of the 40s and the 50s and all of that? I think that part of the allure of something like the old Hollywood landscape is because at this point, we're getting stuff that feels so close to us. I think it's interesting that I'm seeing stuff from the 90s come back and I'm like, most people when they hit a certain age, time starts acting really funny.
mm.
So for me, I'll joke with my mom, but not really. I'm like, well, 2008 was only like 10 years ago, right? It wasn't that far. It doesn't feel that far. Mostly too, we forget that COVID and the start of 2020 really did like that these feel like lost years, and then you add in the political element. So for me, I'm like my culture starting to come back as something that people are idealizing and whatnot. I'm like, that just feels like yesterday. Old Hollywood feels like a long time ago. There's
Mm.
that sense of distance where now we can kind of look at it again. And I don't think we've done that yet with stuff like the 90s. It's interesting that we're seeing the return of like thinspo on social media, and we've never reconciled with the generation of young girls, including myself, that like have dealt with that whole topic. We're talking once again about the sexualization of young girls, and we never once dealt with the sexualization of young girls in the 2000s. So it's a really interesting time, and kind of going back on the podcast and talking about certain movies, I'm like, you can watch Cabaret now, and it still feels, unfortunately, very, very timely, even timelier than it probably was when it came out in the 70s. So, for me, I'm like, the hope is to kind of learn about our cinematic past through looking at these movies, but also how society looked at things in the 1940s or the 1930s or the silent era and ask, have we changed at all? Have we learned from any of this? And in a lot of instances, the answer is no.
I read a book by a guy called Jaron Lanier, who I think he did the book called 10 Reasons You Should Delete Your Social Media Accounts. He's done a bunch of books. He kind of he himself is a tech entrepreneur but anyway, he's very critical of tech, and he talks about pattern exhaustion, which is like I think it's in from archaeology where cultures which have ceramics, after a while, they will just run out of patterns. They've just
Yeah.
gone through
Yeah.
them all in a period of a couple of hundred years, and you will see them repeating and going back and sort of essentially becoming nostalgic. And he kind of set claims that we've done the same thing with music, that you've had these major revolutions which took place every 2 decades or so up until the 90s with hip hop, and then after the 90s it's kind of just been, his argument is you could take a song from the past 30 years, and if no one's heard it before, and play it to them, and they wouldn't be able to accurately guess which year it's from.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that film is slowly starting to feel like that,
Mm,
especially with streamers. I think the Ankler just did an article recently about like, does any movie over the last, 5 to 10 years have a cultural footprint?
mm,
And especially if it's something that's premiered on Netflix or premiered on Amazon Prime Video. And that's something I've been asking myself a lot over the last, couple years as streaming has started to dominate is, there are movies that I watch on Amazon that I really enjoyed at the time. or something on Netflix that I really enjoyed at the time. I'm like, but I don't feel the need to go back and rewatch them, and if I don't know that they exist because Netflix, the algorithm or whatever, isn't telling me, oh, you liked this movie. It's that if the tree falls in the woods, does anybody hear it? Like, do I even know it existed? And that's funny because my algorithm will remind me 100 times a day about like, you love Bring It On. Here's clips from Bring It On, and I'm like, okay, so clearly there's some sort of footprint with that. But you start to see those footprints kind of disappear again, starting around, 2019, 2018. And I do wonder if the cultural significance of film in the next 30 some odd years, are we just going to be talking about like the only contributions from the 2020s in film is Sinners and Barbie?
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. And one final bit before we get into the book. I read your piece as well on Wuthering Heights recently when you were talking about influencers, and this speaks directly to that same cultural change, but from our point of view as film critics, where I do, and we're talking just after the Washington Post revealed that they've fired a third of their staff because, Jeff Bezos needs to cut costs.
Of course, of course. Why wouldn't the richest man in the world need to cut some costs?
I just wanted, yeah, I just wanted for you to go over that for our listeners who I
Yeah.
would also direct you obviously to read the piece.
Yeah, exactly. Shout out to my site, thefilmmaven.com. Yeah, but I mean, I know that I had a couple people come at me and say, it sounded like sour grapes. You didn't get invited to the premiere, so you're taking it out on other people that did. And no, I've been talking a lot over the last year about influencers taking dominance over actual film journalists and film critics. And my issue is that it really does demean what film critics and film journalists do when you are taking somebody that is just good at selling themselves or selling something. I think influencers are a subset of paid marketing. I think they are a subset of sponsored content. And yet, they'll advertise on their site if something is an ad, if they're a partner with some brand, but they won't advertise and they won't say that an idea is that something is sponsored content if it's a film premiere, where most of the time travel or lodgings or something is comped. Usually
Mm-hmm.
there's always a pay for play. And when, I tell people it doesn't have to be financial. If somebody's paying for you to stay at the Beverly Hills Hotel and they paid for your airfare and all of that, money has changed hands. And you cannot at that point be impartial about what you're doing. And I get why studios do it. They want to put butts in seats, even though there's really no proof that influencers translate into box office. But they want, a person that can sell themselves and sell an opinion that is overly positive. You don't want people kind of salt in the water. But the problem that I think that's starting to have is it's trickling down into actual journalism where you are seeing influencers that are invited to junkets, that are invited to sit down with celebrities and talk to them. And usually, a lot of those interviews, as we've seen, go viral because the person that is doing the interviewing is not a skilled interviewer or they're not a journalist. So, I always roll my eyes when somebody forwards a clip that's like this person didn't watch the movie and they admitted it to the person that they're interviewing, or they asked a really dumb question and it goes viral. I'm like, that just ends up demeaning what journalism is. It makes people assume, because people don't separate influencer from journalist, they assume that all journalists are dumb. And it's also taking away opportunities, as we're seeing a lot of journalists who are now out of work, who are now trying to go the independent route, like, who are turning to Substack and they're trying to maintain access. The hardest thing for people to realize is that, when you leave a big outlet, your Q rating goes in the toilet.
Mm.
So, and I've experienced that. When I left my full-time job, I had a lot of reps at various places that were like, "Well, we love you, Kristen. You're really great, but we can't give you access. You have a piddly little site." And yet, if I was an influencer with, 50,000 followers, I could probably get in. So it really is demoralizing that I think studios and creatives are pivoting to this kind of instant gratification, which I think is what influencers are. That they're able to just kind of instantly say something is amazing, and it's always amazing or perfect, or it's this very hyperbolic language. And it limits the opportunities for actual journalists. And I think it also sets an ugly precedent for what journalism is. Again, I've had young people come to me that say they want to be journalists, and I'm like, okay, well, what kind of journalism do you want to do? And they're like, I want to interview celebrities. And I'm like,
Mm,
that's not what our job is. That's what an influencer's job is. But it's not
mm,
what my job is. Do I get to interview celebrities sometimes? Sure. Am I also kind of doing the grunt work of like learning about the business and, learning about all these other things and writing about trends and not always talking to people? Yes. And they're like, I don't want to do that. I'm like, right, because some influencer sat down with Margot Robbie and you think that that's what the whole thing is. And it's not.
mm.
So it's very frustrating to me. And I've interviewed influencers. They're very sweet young people. They're almost always young people. And I had an influencer, very sweet girl, who, when I asked her, I'm like, how do you feel? How do you respond to criticism about people saying that you're taking critics' jobs and that you haven't earned any of this? And her response, she was a 21-year-old girl, was just like, well, I don't really understand why critics just can't get on the internet, why they can't just talk into a camera and tell people their opinion, and it's the same thing. And I'm like, it's not the same thing though.
Mm.
And I don't even think influencers understand the distinction at this point anymore. I know they know that they're feeling left out. I know that I know that they are aware that we are looking down on them, and I think they're kind of chalking it up to like old fogey syndrome or something. But I don't know what the answer is. But I know that there is this division that is happening, and it's only going to lead to more journalists, unfortunately, I think, leaving the industry entirely, and the concept of film criticism being less valued.
Preach. I can't fault you on anything you've said there. And I would add my 2 cents of I hate the glam bot.
I mean, I wish I was making Glambot money. I think we all wish that. So,
Yeah, but I mean that guy, it's a slow motion camera. What am I missing here? What am I
yeah,
missing? But
you're
also
missing the
that's
name recognition.
exactly. And the other thing is, I think this I think this goes to what you're saying is it seems to all be about a creation of moments that are real that you can just
Yeah.
scroll through. And so one of my pet peeves when it comes to interviewing is when the journalist instead of like giving an interesting interview or or creating a moment in which an interesting interview can take place, they create a moment of some sort of personal connection with the interviewee. So it'll be like, oh, I've brought out my book of tickets from when I first went to see Mission Impossible, Tom Cruise. Oh, wow, isn't that amazing? Oh, it's like, well, what, you're just fanboying.
It's it plays on the what the influencer has cultivated is this brand of authenticity. That they're authentic, that they're not the man. I mean, I think there's a line that can be kind of traced between the Gen Xer concept of selling out and the influencer, where this idea of wanting to live authentically. And I definitely there are some people where I'm like, oh, that's kind of cute. And then there are some people where I'm like, that's kind of unprofessional. If
Mm.
I did that as a journalist, it would be very awkward. Like I always laugh when influencers like sit down with like a good-looking celebrity and be like, you're so much hotter in person. And I'm like, if I said that as a journalist, it would probably not go over well, but because you're, chicken shop date or something, like you're allowed to do that. And I think that again, it blurs the ethics of everything. It just it really does blur. And I mean, I think that's also something that we're slowly starting to see. I said it at the end of the Wuthering Heights article I did, where I was like, influencers are celebrities. We need to start saying that.
Mm.
So it's not inappropriate when, you know, an influencer dates a celebrity because they are both celebrities at that point. It's weird and awkward if a journalist starts dating a celebrity, even though that happens. But there's codes of conduct, I think, that we're not talking about anymore. And I think influencers are really starting to blur those boundaries. And it does set a lot of just really weird rules that I'm not privy. I don't like. I'm not cool with them.
Yeah, I mean, we could talk about this for it's such an interesting moment. There is an element of apocalyptic, specifically for our category of
Existential dread, yes.
precisely for what we do. But let's get on to the book because the book is amazing as well. And I want to let's wheel back to our mutual love of old movies because one of the in the very first chapter, I just loved your description of Lon Chaney Jr. as being this marvelous, with caveats about certain things, but this marvelous actor who portrayed disabled characters, and particularly as well. In addition to that, your love of the movie Freaks, something I also share. Again, caveats ahoy. I think that's true whenever we go back and look at movie history. We just have to. I think there almost should be like a trigger warning or disclaimer you just put at the front of any movie history book where you just go, things were
Right.
different then. Let's just go. Let's just, you know,
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, things were different then, but I would argue in some cases things are different now in a bad way.
true.
Freaks, I think, is a great example. As far as I know, it still holds the record for the most physically disabled actors on one film set in America. I've never heard of another movie that's bested that. And that was a movie from 1932. Do we have a movie with a large, predominantly physically disabled cast of actors in today's world? No, we don't. So I think that in some instances we've only gotten worse, or at least lack of acknowledging our own flaws there. But Freaks is great. Freaks is, I think, I get that there are disabled people, because we're not a monolith, we do disagree, who think that it's exploitative. But I think for me, in a landscape where I compartmentalize so many of my likes of certain movies, I think Freaks is one of those where I don't have to compartmentalize much. It's so fascinating. And Lon Chaney Sr. Um, doing all of the things he did in the silent era, Phantom of the Opera, and especially The Penalty, and um, He Who Gets Slapped, and a lot of other movies he did. I kind of give Lon Guff, excuse me for 1 second. I kind of give Lon Guff for how he advertised playing some of these disabled people. He talks about like rolling around on the floor and whatnot. But at the same time, I think that however he plays the character, other things have to match that level. So, you watch something like The Penalty, which was made in 1919, and the production design of that film is so accessible. And it didn't have to be. I mean, Lon Chaney Sr. was not disabled, but he's playing this disabled character that lives in this disabled world that is adapted to him. So if you watch The Penalty, you'll see ramps very, elegantly utilized in his house. You'll see him climb up this wall. He's trying to see through a peephole in the door, and he gets these pegs that look like rock climbing pegs, and he just starts because he has no legs. He starts scaling this wall like Spider-Man, and I'm like, that's really inventive because it's believing that he lives in this world and it's creating a world that would be suited for him. And I think that you don't see that in production design where the character is disabled but is played by an abled actor. Maybe the camera doesn't shoot from the ground, so you don't know if there's a ramp or if it's a curb, or the character has lost a limb, but they're in long pants or dresses the rest of the movie. So odds are that character ain't having to rely on the knowledge that they are, an amputee of some kind. So it's frustrating to look at some of those silent films and see like, oh yeah, they actually were trying to do the work, even though they're not casting authentically, but they're at least creating a world that makes you say like, this is a world for disabled people.
And he also introduces in one of his films a sort of figure that appears throughout the book, which is the able-bodied person character, not actor, but character, mimicking a disabled person for some perceived advantage.
Yeah, yeah, the able-bodied buffer is something that, I tell people it's so funny when people tell it to me. They're like, I noticed that the other day. I'm like, yay, my words. But I mean, I think once you start watching movies about disability, you start to realize how often they're about able-bodied people who either become disabled late in life or are tangentially connected to a disabled person, but they're the star of the film. So, if you watch something like, I'm trying to think of like The Theory of Everything. The Theory of Everything does both. It does two different things. So you get Stephen Hawking ambulatory as an abled person for about 20-ish minutes of the movie before he's struck down with disability. But then the movie is not really about him 100%. It's also about his wife, who is the able-bodied person that is trying to deal with him and also sublimate her own desires. Rain Man, another great example. The movie's not really about Raymond, the Dustin Hoffman character who is autistic. It's really more about his brother who, kidnaps him and wants his money, but learns to be an adult through interacting with him. And all of it just undermines the actual disabled characters and emphasizes the fact that, if you're an able person, disabled people are so mysterious, you're never going to understand them unless you see them be like you. And B, the whole thing is like befriend a disabled person, because your main character syndrome will definitely get a kick out of it. And also, there's always like money or prestige or something connected with them. And, you'll be important by proxy.
Yeah, or you'll impress the girlfriend in
Yeah.
terms of sort of
Or you'll just become a better person. Capital B,
mm,
capital P.
and who wants to be a better person anyway? I'm not I'm not utterly convinced.
According to disabled movies, a lot of people want to be better people, but better people in the wrong way, like not actually good people.
And one thing you pointed out, which I thought was really interesting as well, was the idea of the characters who were coded as disabled. So you use Frankenstein as an example of this, for instance, and that's something. Again, this is where I loved this book because it really made me think of Frankenstein in a totally new way. And frankly, Frankenstein is one of those movies you just think I'm never going to think of this in a new way because I've seen it so many times, I've understood it so many times. But all of a sudden, I was thinking, oh my God, yeah, that's absolutely right.
Yeah, the 33 version I think is more disabled coded than something like the Guillermo version. Which I love the Guillermo version, but I think that yeah, for the Boris Karloff interpretation is really interesting because it wasn't something I had immediately thought of, but I had as I was doing more reading, I had read that a lot of people consider Frankenstein a disabled character because he's nonverbal,
Mm.
and because of the lumbering gait. And I think that that's really interesting because, you know, when I tell people about coded disability, they're like, "Oh, that's just because you want to see disability in everything." And I'm like, "Well, that's part of it because disability is so absent from so many movies that, we have to kind of gravitate to people that espouse that so that we can feel some semblance of seeing. I call The Little Mermaid a coded disabled narrative, because for me as somebody growing up who did not have disability other than herself and her family, who didn't see it every day. To learn about myself, I gravitated to characters that I was like had something that I felt akin to myself. And the Little Mermaid, I'm like, she's got a tail. She can't walk on land. I can't walk as well. And what does she want? She wants to be where the people are. She wants to go out and do things. And I was like, that's like me. So I think that Disney handles that right? with the end of the movie. I tell people all the time when they start going on about like The Little Mermaid's a story about how she has to lose her voice for a man. I'm like, no, The Little Mermaid is a story about how society won't accept her unless she can walk. That's the bigger issue. But I think that that's what we're forced often as disabled viewers to do is, we're not getting enough movies about us for us. So all we can do is kind of latch on to the characters that feel like outsiders or that feel limited in some way as a means of saying we have something.
And interestingly, as well, you have this idea. Well, you bring up this idea that there's almost like a rationing of identity in Hollywood. In that, okay, you can be black or you can be disabled, and there are even examples that you use in Forrest Gump where someone who is black or someone who, or Get Out, where someone who has a disability will say to a black person, "I know how it feels to be black because I too have," as if those things were sort of quantifiable and equivalent. And the idea that you could also be black and disabled and a woman and not heteronormative, it's something that Hollywood can't deal with. That's like some sort of exaggeration, as if people like that just simply can't exist.
Yeah, intersectionality is a big thing, and it was interesting. I didn't I was worried about focusing on race and disability because, I'm a white person. I have a clear amount of white privilege, but I was like, it would be ridiculous of me not to acknowledge where race is in disability cinema and at the same time how bad it is because we can't talk about two things at once. Hollywood talks about what is simplest. So when it comes to disability, if you have race in there, racism's too hard to talk about. It's ugly. Some people, you don't want to make your audience feel like they're racist, right? So it's easier to just kind of throw that out and just focus on ableism because who wants to be mean to a disabled person? Now, if that person is a disabled black person, it's ridiculous not to deal with race. The big movie I talk in the book in the chapter is about Radio, the Cuba Gooding Jr. movie, and I think what is interesting is so often when you see disabled characters that are black, they are often men. They are often black men. Black women remain one of the lowest groups of people that have movies about them in general, but also are disabled on screen. And I think that a lot of that again is racism that, what's the best way to, kind of neuter a character's perceived, violence? Well, you make them disabled. So the disabled black man is a gentle giant. He's John Coffey in The Green Mile. There's
Mm.
nothing threatening about him. If characters think that he's threatening, it's because they're racist. But we're not going to deal with that part. We're going to deal with the ableist part. So like in Radio, there are certain situations, and I think watching this post, Black Lives Matter and post George Floyd only made me more angry because, there's scenes in Radio where he has an encounter with police. And historically, we know there are statistics that say that Black disabled men are at a far higher risk of death and violence by police than anybody else. And to watch him in this movie being abducted by white teens who throw him in a shed and lock him in there, and I was just like, the movie plays it as these disabled boys. Race is incidental. Took this disabled man and threw him in a shed. I'm like, no, I'm seeing a bunch of white guys take a black man off the street and throw him in a shed. And, the response in the movie is like, well, boys will be boys. And I'm like, is it though? He has an interaction with police where they throw him on the hood of the car and they take him to jail. And the whole plot point, I'm like, well, I think it's good that he's alive at least in this movie because, like, in reality, we probably know how this would have ended. But the movie always reiterates white people are good to disabled people, so the cops, there's other cops that show up at the police station and they're like, Radio, why are you in jail? And they're like, well, Jim over here, it's his first day of work. He clearly does not know Radio, local celebrity disabled black man Radio. Take him out. They apologize to him. They eat sandwiches with him. It's this whole thing, and it's utterly ridiculous because We know that ableism exists. We know that racism exists. And yet movies will say, there's a quote in the book, and the author, I'm forgetting her name, says that the concept, I think it's talking about the magical Negro trope. Um, and so much of what that the author uses in there is relevant to this, which is that, the creation of the magical Negro is this idea that the character is only affected by a few bad people. So that black people really have no reason to complain because everybody in the movie is good to them. And I think
Mm.
disability is the same way. Disabled complaints about ableism are not valid because look at these characters that are all accepting, that learn through interaction with this character how to be good.
I think what was very fair about the book, where you were so willing to look for good, good examples as well as tropes which were negative, but there are some interesting tropes that I thought were, again, a sort of educational thing that I loved, where you were talking about how like a certain kind of wheelchair would not be used, or how somebody would move a wheelchair if it was being if it was an abled actor using the wheelchair, and being too strenuous about it or using the strength inappropriately. And then you had you pointed to a film which I was very glad sort of you appreciated, because it's one of my favorite directors, Hal Ashby's Coming Home, as a counterexample of, like, okay, these people have taken time, researched it, and taken care to do a really good job of representing a lived reality.
Yeah, coming home, when people ask me what I think they should watch, I will usually point to coming home. Because even though, and I mean, there's caveats with most every movie in the book, even though John Voight is not disabled,
Mm.
the world in which he lives and the authenticity to that experience is so accurate. At least it's accurate to me as a wheelchair user. That I can put aside the fact that John Voight is not, disabled, and also that he's like a horrible human being who has disowned the movie. So whatever. But I think to watch that movie too, you're also realizing what a pre-ADA Americans with Disabilities world looks like on screen, because the movie was made in 78, filmed in set in 68 though. So, and the ADA doesn't really become a thing until the 90s. And so for me, every time I watch that movie, the way John Voight, the little bits of business and how the character is ignored by people, that's very authentic. I can tell you that happens to me all the time. The fact that, but I think what I'm always struck by is how the world around him is so designed against the disabled, because again, this is pre-ADA. So there's stairs everywhere in the movie. He goes to the police station, there's a stair. He's trying to get into somebody's home, you'll watch him try to pull himself up. The physical process of him trying to enter spaces, I think, is amazing because we don't discuss that enough. Editing has made for movies about disabled people, it's just like cut to they're in the house. How they got in the house, who cares? You don't need to know that. You see John Voight in Coming Home making a ramp for his building so that he can get into it. And also, I think the fact that the movie sells the fact that disabled people can be sexual, he drives a cool car. He has a house. He has all these things. His life is not inherently sad, and really, he's not upset about his disability. He is upset about how the system treats disabled veterans returning to America after serving their country, which I would tell you, we also have done nothing to fix in 2026. So I think for me, it's amazing that Ashby and Jane Fonda were able to make that movie because Hollywood didn't want that. They tried very hard to work to get Walter Reed Hospital. They wanted to work with the government, and the government at the time, I think this was the Carter, or no, it was the Ford administration, said no. The movie's too critical. We're not going to do that. And then once Carter came in, he had actually hired a disabled person for whatever the job was with regards to like filmmaking, and he said we'll let you in. And they were like, yeah, too bad we already filmed the movie. So we can't say you cooperated. But it's so authentic too. And watching John Voight wheel that wheelchair, he talked about a lot in the 70s, spending time at various rehab hospitals and meeting guys that were paralyzed and were full-time wheelchair users, and he became friendly with them. He would call them the boys. He would bring them over to his house, and a lot of times he said, I felt out of place because I wasn't in a wheelchair. These guys outnumber me, they're bonding and they're doing all these things. And he would actually spend his time with them in the wheelchair because he felt that it for him, he was the outsider, which I thought was really interesting because so often the disabled person is the outsider. But he would live, play and hang out amongst them as a wheelchair user, and they were like, everybody was equal and everything was cool. So I thought that was the behind the scenes stuff, I think, translates to how authentic the movie on screen is.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you talk about um, the other people who have disabilities, representing people who have disabilities on screen, disabled actors, in other words, there are, I mean, for instance, Freaks, they're disabled actors. There are disabled actor. There's a disabled actor who is the center of The Best Years of Our Lives. Children of a Lesser God is another one that you mentioned, who won an Oscar, and was kind of very unfairly treated by not only the industry, but also by her boyfriend of the time, William Hurt, who doesn't come out of the book at all well.
No, I mean William Hurt, I think, has been presented multiple places as kind of a horrific human being. And Marlee Matlin was very candid about their dynamic when she wrote her memoirs, which is where I had heard that. And I think there's been some other stories since then, allegations about him since he's passed. And I think, especially Marley and Harold Russell, the actor from Best Years of Our Lives, you know, we do disabled actors very dirty still, I
Mm,
think. I think it's a little better in England. I think that there's a lot more disabled creatives behind the camera and writing scripts and doing more things. America's still very much behind the times. But when Harold Russell did Best Years, he won 2 Oscars. And that movie was very much made as this kind of propaganda piece. It's a brilliant film, but he was kind of trotted out as the reason that you should make this movie because he was at the time one of the few bilateral amputees that was out there. And he won 2 Oscars, and this is a story I've never been able to verify. I quoted in the book because I of where I found it, but I'm still not 100% certain if it's apocryphal or not. I think it's true though. He asked William Wyler, the director, okay, what do I do now? Like, how do I get an agent? Like, what am I doing? And he's like, you should go back to school. You should go get a trade because we have no reason to make movies anymore. War's over.
mm,
You're done. Which is funny because Wyler was a deaf director. He had lost his hearing during the war and continued to work because he was only partially deaf in one ear. So it was very upsetting, and Russell tried to do other things. He was part of like a cabaret show, and he felt that it was exploiting him, so he ended up leaving. And this was a movie that had publicized, kind of compelled him to get married, so that they could advertise like he's a disabled man who has married a woman. And Harold Russell ended up, going back to the real world and working and cultivating a life. And in 1980, Richard Donner put him in Inside Moves. And he's great to see. But he is also the only actual disabled person in that movie. And it shouldn't have taken that long for him to make a movie. He had to end up selling his Oscar to pay for his wife's medical care. And I think that's really ironic that, the movie gave him 2 Academy Awards and Hollywood did nothing for him after that. Marlee Matlin has also been very vocal about how, after doing Children of a Lesser God and winning the Oscar, not only was her boyfriend telling her she didn't deserve the award, but she was trying to make, she's talked about how there weren't people knocking on her door to make movies. You've just won an Oscar. We want to make a movie with you, because the belief was there's no deaf roles.
Mm.
So we have to write deafness into everything. Why would we cast you when we'd have to change our script? As opposed to just casting her as a character who just happens to be deaf. So I don't think we've done right by disabled actors at all. And I still don't think we are. Troy Kotzer won the Oscar for Coda, and it took him about 5 years to make another movie. He's in a movie right now. But again, I don't see him getting the opportunities that another actor for a best actor, Oscar winner is going to get, after they win. Um, Marissa Bodie is in Wicked. I think that's great. I'm more interested to see what Marissa Bodie does after Wicked. Is she only going to be able to do roles where they have a wheelchair in them, or is she going to be able to play characters that just happen to have wheelchairs?
Yeah, that it's not necessarily the point of the whole film or a central sort of
Yeah,
aspect.
yeah.
I mean, it's not her entire character.
No, no, nor should it be. I think that there is this stigma, and Freaks kind of set it up. This idea that disabled actors can only play disabled characters.
Mm,
And we don't say that with any other minority group. Gay
mm.
actors don't just play gay characters. Characters of color don't just play movies about, oppression of their race. And disabled actors shouldn't have to do that either. It was really interesting. I wrote a piece for IndieWire a couple years ago when Snow White was in the process of being made, the Disney version, and I talked to actors who were little people, and they were all really upset about how should they have to exclusively play, elves? Uh, no, they should not. But those are the roles that they so often get. But with the rise of CGI, well, CGI, you can just squish Hugh Grant down into an Oompa Loompa. You can just squish an A-list actor down into a little person. And the few roles that they were getting are now gone. Because the problem is that technology is evolving, but people aren't writing roles to cover what is being lost. So, little people are not being given the few pittance of the roles they were getting, but nobody else is writing roles for little people, nor are they casting little people in other roles that aren't exclusively meant for little people. So we continue to, I think, lose the more we close the door against disability. We're not crafting new roles for them, but we're also not interested in giving them the few roles that would be available to them.
It seems to be part of the homogenizing of, we were talking earlier about streaming cinema sort of having a sort of homogenous look at times, and the type, it feels like that's the view of the world now. Everything looks like it's from central casting. There's no sense of diversity. We've got this horrible word that people use, which I would rather cancel from the dictionary, the woke. I just think it's been so badly abused. It needs to be, if you're anti-woke, you're just a bigot in my book. I'm not having any truck with you.
Yeah.
But I look at Hal Ashby and I see his world in The Last Detail. I see his world in Coming Home, and it's just enormous. It's got everything in it. The whole world is there. I see a John Cassavetes film. It's got the whole world is included, and that includes disabilities without it necessarily. I mean, even, and this might be a little bit out of the blue, but even Todd Phillips in The Joker had like a little person in the film whose role was not to be a little person, even though his stature at some point becomes a grotesque joke, admittedly. But I loved kind of the completeness of his arc when he turns up in the sequel. I was one of the few people actually thought the sequel was very good. Um, I'll be taking your questions later.
No, I mean, I think that, that's the next frontier. I tell people casting is easy. Casting is the floor. It's so easy, in fact, that you would think that most people would just do it, and then they would be like, well, now you can shut up because we've cast, all these roles with disabled people. For me, I'm looking at where are the disabled directors, screenwriters, producers, costume people? I think that's the next step. But the problem is if we can't get cast, then we're not gonna get those next bits. And it requires disability, I think, to be on the minds of everybody. There are no disabled, as far as I know, people running studios, greenlighting projects. So if we don't have people in the C-suites, they're not going to care. And so I think for me, I tell people 1 in 4 have a disability. That means 3 in 4 don't. So by sheer numbers, we need abled allies to care about this. And, if you're an able producer, and you meet somebody that's disabled and they're like, I got a project, look at it, consider it, because I think that we definitely need more abled people to use their privilege at this point to further. We can only do so much. If we're outside the room yelling at the door, we still aren't getting in the room. It's just we're standing outside the door waiting for an able person to be like, okay, actually, why don't we open the door and let you come in and talk about it? So, Sebastian Stan doing his Golden Globe speech and talking about the need for more inclusive storytelling. That's fantastic. Sebastian Stan can use his privilege though, and I think make some inroads on that if he wants to. And I hope he does. Mike Flanagan has utilized disability in 2 of his productions so far. I would love for him to use that privilege and work with more disabled creatives, not in front of the camera, but behind the camera. So I think that unfortunately, disabled people are coming to a point where we're going as far as we are allowed to go. Now the next step is on the multitude of people in Hollywood that have privilege. Steven Spielberg wants to make a movie. He wants to put a disabled person as the lead of Disclosure Day. He's going to be able to do that, because he's Steven Spielberg at the end of the day. George Clooney wants to cast a disabled person, in his film. He has the ability to do that. So I think that we need the allies to step up, because if they don't care about this, sheer numbers means that we're not going to get any progress.
Do you think as well, though, as evidenced by William Wyler, who you cited earlier, that and as evidenced by what you said earlier, that disabled people are not a monolithic group, and there is no necessary natural automatic unity to any group, no matter how oppressed they may be, that there are people who say are deaf in the way that William Wyler was, don't necessarily think of themselves in the same way as other people who might not be ambulatory or might have another physical. For instance, you talk about the pretty disabled, the person. I mean, you talk about it in terms of a character.
Yeah.
I was also thinking when you were speaking, because my mind's racing here with thoughts about having only just read your book as well. There are people who my favorite writer is James Joyce, and he was pretty much blind for his adult life, had a deteriorating eyesight for pretty much since he was 20 on until he was practically blind by the time he died. And yet you never think of James Joyce as, you always think of James Joyce as the Irish writer, not as the
Yeah.
partially sighted writer. You never think of Beethoven. Well, maybe you do think of Beethoven as a deaf composer, but yeah, well, you see what I mean.
Yeah, I think the belief right now is that disability is a medical condition. It's not an identifier. So
Right.
when people talk about, representation, it's usually gender, race, sexual orientation. Those are the identifiers. Those are your personal kind of things that you can't change. We don't talk about disability that way. We
Right.
talk about it as a medical condition. And if it's a medical condition, then it can change. It can go away. And I think that's one of the biggest issues right now is that if we are not considering disability as a personal identifier, I am a woman who is white, who is straight. I'm also disabled, and I can't change and I can't eliminate any one of those things. And when I tell people, I'm a disabled woman, I've gotten my fair share of people that are like, "Oh, but your disability doesn't define you." Do I let it define me in terms of blaming it as the reason I am limited in life? No, but it does define me because it does alter my choices. It does alter my way of life. It does define me. I can't ignore that. And I think that until we start kind of getting out of those outdated ways of looking at disability, we're not going to change things. I mean, I think there's a reason why the magic cure is such a popular trope in disability film, the idea, and it happens a lot with women. You look at something like the end of Magnificent Obsession, where Jane Wyman's character has a brain tumor and she's blind, and Rock Hudson removes the brain tumor, and they're like, she's gonna see again, or the end of Fair to Remember, where Deborah Carr gets hit by a car, and they're like, "Is the relationship with Cary Grant going to change because she's in a wheelchair?" And she ends the story by saying, I'll be able to walk again, because because you love me." And I think that that's the frustrating thing. We see definition. She's not letting that wheelchair define her. She's thinking she's going to walk. Damn it. Which I would love to see the rest of that movie where it's like she keeps trying to walk and they're like, your spine is fucking crushed. Like it's not gonna happen. Stop trying, okay? So I think that that's the big thing is we need to stop counting it as a medical problem, that the unspoken thing is that it's gonna go away. We need to start talking about it as a personal identifier, as part of our DNA, as our race and our sexual orientation and our gender.
Yeah, yeah. I would even add to some degree class into that because, as you
Yeah,
mentioned, when it talks about when you talk about caretakers and the provision of medical care to people, the class that you belong to can be highly significant. I mean, if you're Christopher Reeve or Michael J.
yeah.
Fox, your relationship to your disability is going to be a lot different from someone who doesn't have those advantages.
Yeah. I should mention I probably will have to wrap it up in about 10.
Okay,
So,
okay.
yeah. But no, you're so on point because yeah, Christopher Reeve is a great example. When he was paralyzed, he wanted to work. He wanted to keep working. And he did an adaptation of Rear Window that was on television. And that movie is hilarious because he's got like a Siri system. I don't want to say the other thing because I don't want mine to start talking to me. He's
Mm,
got this whole voice activated system in 1997 before that was ever even a thing. And he talks about, do you know how expensive it is to be disabled? Well, yeah, but it helps that your character is presented as this guy that's got money. So I don't really know what you're bitching about. But I think the big thing too is that because we don't see disabled people talking about money, or we only talk about them through other characters. Coming Home is a great example. There's a black orderly that talks about how much money the disabled character is making on disability. There is a real stigma that I think movies have a hand in perpetuating this idea that disabled people are independently wealthy and or are getting money off of the government. There is a reason why we have the Social Security system here in America under attack, because I think that there is this belief that, and I've had people tell me this, well, the government gives you money, and I'm like, yeah, do you understand, A, how little the government gives you? It's about 2 grand a month, which good luck living in any major metropolis or anywhere at this point for 2 grand a month. And that's supposed to pay all your bills, all your expenses the entire month. You work, it's make a dollar, depending on what part of the disability system you're on, it's make a dollar, take a dollar. Thank you, Ronald Reagan, for that. If you get married, that affects how much money you make. If you buy a house, that affects how much money you make. Everything becomes, we are not going to let you have 1 penny more than we believe you deserve. So there's all these hoops. I'm like, so if you would love to jump through those hoops to get my $2,000 a month, you are welcome to it. And I think that that's the problem is when movies show disabled white men, Bryan Cranston living in a high rise in New York, in the Upside, Stephen Hawking and his wife living in a really nice house, in The Theory of Everything. It's perpetuating this idea that disabled people have no reason to complain. You all are financially set. It's why I love David Gordon Green's Stronger. The movie's not perfect, but it does show a middle class, lower middle class character. Jake Gyllenhaal's character is seen living in an apartment that is not built for him because, spoiler alert, we don't actually get any type of accessible housing. He's navigating these small spaces. He's not living a lavish lifestyle. We don't see that enough, because I don't think most creatives know it exists. They don't know about the disability system in America. And if they don't see it, they can't write about it. And I think that's a huge issue.
Absolutely, I totally agree. Well, listen, Kristen, we could talk
We
for
could. I know. I'm bummed I gotta wrap it up.
no worries. One last thing that I will ask you though is, could you give us a recommended film book? Is there a book that you particularly like, or you read in the past that inspired you? Anything at all?
I mean, I love the books. It has nothing to do with disability, but I love the books written by Janine Basinger about Hollywood. She does a great one about marriage in the movies.
Mm.
Um, and I think that one is just it's a book I hold up high when I'm like, I wish I could write books like this. Where she's talking about a very niche subject, the idea of marriage in film, and talking about how that has changed over the history of film, with regards to gender, with regards to marital roles, all these things. And it's really fun to read too. I think that's the way she describes movies is really accessible. So I would definitely recommend any book that she writes. You're in for a good time.
Yeah, a former guest of the podcast as well.
Oh, yay! I
Yay.
have not met Janine in person yet, so I still really want to get her on the show at some point. So
Oh,
I might
she's
have to hit you up for an introduction.
I will be happy to do that. Absolutely, anytime you like. Well, listen, it's been wonderful talking to you, Kristen, and I can't
Same.
wait to see what you're going to do next. And I'm gonna run out now and order your last book as well, so that I can.
Yeah, well, my next book, I have a book coming out, but have you read the book Volume 2 coming out in July?
Oh,
So there's way more books.
excellent. So you'll be back.
Yes, please. Yes, I will be around. Yes.
Absolutely wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll click off.